adventurers, I'm Elizabeth Beckley. In today's tutorial, we will be painting the Manticore from Quests of Yore. The colors I will be using in today's video are all from Reaper Master Series paints: Mahogany Brown, Linen White, Dusty Skin Shadow, Lone Star Leather, Golden Blonde, Walnut Brown, Hallowed Orange, Nightmare Black, Crusader Silver, Ebony Flesh, Ergotha Red, Seone Scarlet, and Chestnut Gold. The paint colors I will be using are Mahogany Brown, Lone Star Leather, Golden Blonde, Chestnut Gold, Hallowed Orange, Walnut Brown, Ergotha Red, and Ebony Flesh. You can see before I've started painting, I already have some of my base coats down. For the video, I am going to show you what base coats are. I'll also show you layering. To start off with a base coat, I am going to use a thicker paint right off of my palette to go ahead and cover all of this area that I want with a good color, a good coverage of that color. I'm going to work with one of her wings here. And I'm going to start off, I'm going to base coat with Ergotha Red. It's probably going to take me 1 or 2 coats of paint to completely cover up this section. And this is what I'll do to the whole model with my base colors. But for right now, I just want to show you, and then you can go and apply this to all of the miniature with your different colors that you've chosen. I start with my darker colors first, and I work my way up to my lighter colors. I'll do this by layering, and layering is working in smaller and smaller areas to achieve a highlight. I'll let that dry, and I'll move over to the other wing. You can see I have a lot of paint on my paintbrush, but not so much that it's kind of building up on the brush itself. It's more that I'm loading the brush with the paint color. I do try and be careful to paint inside of the lines here, so I try not to get my paint color on other areas. If you do, it's okay. You can just go back and touch up those areas with that color paint. For example, this would be a walnut brown that I've used as my base coat. You can see that I'll need to go over it again because I still have some of the white of the model showing through. And I'll let that dry before I go back and add more paint. Normally, I can work with different parts of the model, and when I get back to this point, it will be dry after I've painted the inside of the wings here. If not, feel free to use a hairdryer on a cool setting, and that will help improve the drying time of the paint. So now that it's dry, you can see that it's not completely covering all of the model. So I want to go back and add a second coat of that red. I swapped to a different brush. This one is a synthetic, it's larger, so it will cover more space for me a lot quicker. When you're painting, you can use synthetic brushes. I'm going to use non-synthetic brushes, but that's because they work a lot better and last a lot longer for me. But synthetic brushes work just fine and they are less expensive. I paint a lot of miniatures, so I tend to go through brushes rather quickly. So I need brushes that will last longer. You can see how putting down that second coat really helps. You can also see how I'm using the side of the brush to get some of the spaces here that are a little harder, like the edge of the Manticore's wings. Now you can see where the rest of the model is white. I'll be doing the same thing with base coating. A lot of times, unless she falls off the base, a lot of times the flat brush is helpful to get in these spaces that are hard to reach there, like behind her arm. Now I'm going to demonstrate layering. I'm going to use the chestnut gold and build up to a highlight with the chestnut gold on the wings. So you'll see that I have much less paint in my paintbrush. And what I'm doing is I'm working in layers. So I'm going to work up to the chestnut gold and I'm going to use smaller and smaller layers, and that will give me smooth transitions. You'll also see me doing things like wet blending, which is another painting technique. You can find a lot of different painting techniques online and watch them and try out the ones that you like to apply paint to a miniature. I highly recommend that. There are so many different ways to paint and apply paint to miniatures. And as I'm first starting out, you won't see much of a difference until I start to build up to this color. But you can see here on my palette camera that I'm taking a little bit of my darker color and mixing it in to my lighter color here. And each time I mix a little less of this color and I add a little bit more of the one that's a brighter color. And you can see I'm following the shapes. That's a really helpful way to paint, is to follow the shapes and follow the flow of the model. So the wing, I go down here on the raised parts of the wing and on the top. And I use the side of my brush. It's very helpful to change the angle of your brush and the way you're applying paint. Sometimes I'll come back in, and this is another technique, like I mentioned before, of wet blending. So you take two colors side by side, and then you blend up the middle. You can see I'm starting to get there with some of my colors here on this side where I've been working on the model. I also wanted to point out that I am using a little bottle cap. There are also hobby holders that you can use to put your model on, to hold your model while you're painting, so you don't have to touch your model as much to rub, because if you end up, resting your fingers on the model, which I do a lot in the video, but I would say don't do that, because what's going to happen is it's going to rub off the paint. So you can see as I'm working in smaller and smaller areas. For example, up here, I don't bring the chestnut gold all the way down because I'm creating my highlight. And then I might even add in a little bit of this golden blonde to bring my highlight up even more. And now you see that we've tackled this larger area, which I know can be intimidating, but we've tackled painting the large area of her wings. Now we'll move on to the Manticore's fur/skin. I'm going to be using the ebony flesh, which I already have a base coat of, and I'm going to work up to the hollowed orange, and I'm going to follow it up with my brightest highlights of golden blonde. So the same idea here of working in smaller and smaller areas. This is a little easier because we have less of a space than we did with the wings. So there's smaller spaces to fill in the color. And again, I'm going to work around the model like I did with the wings. That way everything will dry, because the whole idea behind layering is you want those layers of paint to dry and until the next time you come back and add another layer. This is because what happens is if my layer of paint underneath isn't completely dry, it's going to end up moving around by the time I come back to it. And that will make the paint almost, it looks like it will tear. And it will make the consistency or texture very streaky on the model. So you can see that I'm also painting in spaces that, you know, normally you won't see because it's underneath the model, but I still want to give it some realistic color here, because you will be able to see under her hand a little bit, so it does need a little bit of shadow and highlight. Again, you can see how I'm following these shapes. Like the shape of her arm here is more of a cylinder when you break it down. So I start at the top and bring my paint down to underneath her arm. I'm going to start on her face too. When you're thinking about your shadows and highlights on the face, you're going to want to hit her forehead here, and then under her eyes and onto her nose. Basically, those first couple of layers are going to go all over the miniature, or all over the space we're working on, I should say. The reason we put down a base coat is so we're not working on pure white, because that pure white is going to change our colors and it helps give us shadows. I'm not too concerned if I paint outside the lines here. I know earlier I talked about painting outside of the lines, and you do want to be careful, but I can always go back in and clean things up, which is nice, like with her mouth and her lips here. Actually, I'll go in with that red that I have, and I'll paint inside her mouth. I'm going to let those layers up on her face dry and move back around to some of her other fur, like her hand, and continue to build up that color. And you can see how quickly in these little spaces you can build up that color, build up your highlight very quickly into smaller and smaller areas. I'm working pretty fast here. I'm doing a lot of wet blending. I think that it's easier to, for me at least, wet blend on these larger surfaces. That's why I think these models are a lot of fun, because they have these larger surfaces and these large shapes. It makes them easy to paint, in my opinion. The other thing I like to do when I'm painting like this is a lot of times you can follow the sculpt when you're painting to know where you're going to put your highlights. For example, she kind of has her furrowed brow here, and I'm going to work on highlighting that. And this is where a smaller brush will come in handy. And I'm also going to come in and I'm going to paint her teeth a walnut brown and then come back over them with a white. Now I've got some linen white on my palette. I'm going to come in and get some of these details here. I'm going to use the side of my brush. I'm also going to paint her eyes. And if you mess up, it's okay. You can see I got a little white outside of the lines here. I just come in and I clean that up with a little bit of my darker paint. And then again, I'm cleaning up where I painted. You can see with that darker color. I'm also going to take my small brush here and fill in some of my details. And fill in the detail on her eyes. Now I'm going to move on to painting the Manticore's hair. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a slightly bigger brush, and I'm going to be painting her hair. While I get to the highlights, it'll be in these nicely sculpted individual sections, but for right now I'm going to start layering all over. So you can see that I'm trying to lay down a couple of layers here to establish this color. It's actually a lot easier on the back of the head to show examples of this. On the underside, I will take a little bit more time to paint the individual hair here, the sections of hair. And then I won't come back to these because they're more in shadow. So those will stay, especially right under here. Those will stay how they are. So you can see I've covered up a lot of my base coat here. especially at the top of the head. And I'm just using 2 colors. Because I want to make her hair a little darker. And then if I feel like I've brought that highlight up too much, I'll just come back over with the base color to bring that color back down a little bit so it's not as strong of a highlight. And I'm going to add a little bit of brown because I don't want her hair to look gray. So I'm going to add a little bit of brown in here. I realized that it was looking a little gray. Gonna come in and maybe combine these two together. I'm just painting a thin layer over to change the color a little bit. And while that dries, I'll paint the horns on her head. Alright, I'm liking this a lot more. It's not reading as gray for me. And that's how quickly you can fix, mistakes that you might have. Is just really quickly like that, just by adding a different color. Now I'll move on to the Manticore's leather that she's wearing. Also, we're going to be edge highlighting or edge painting her armor with gold paint. Normally when I paint with metallic paints, I will base coat with either a dark brown for gold and a blue or a black for silver, and that's why I chose these colors. So I'm going to paint the leather first. I want to bring up the highlights, but not too much, because if you look in her concept art, it's not super shiny leather. She's seen some battles here. So a lot of this is going to remain darker with just some quick highlights. And same thing with her bracelets here on her arms. I'm actually going to throw some shadows in here. Then some quick highlights. A lot of it I can do this edge highlighting here and then come back in and kind of blend it in. Now I'm going to paint the edges. I'm probably going to want a smaller brush. I'm going to paint the edges here and the spikes gold. And if you need to, you can see that I kind of brace my hand, and I have a nice small brush to do this detail work. But bracing your hands does really help. I have to go over the areas where I painted on the metal, the gold specifically, and give it another coat. It's sort of like the base coating. And this way, when you're going back over it, you can actually go and layer just in the spots that would have more of a highlight. And if you paint outside of the lines, you can go back and I fix things like this. So I'm just hitting the areas that would be receiving more of a highlight. Look at the top of the spikes here. And I can even go in with some of my white and throw down a little bit of a highlight here in spaces to make it look a little bit more realistic. And I'm going to do the same thing with the silver on the sword here. I'm going to get my bigger brush and mix my paint back up on my palette. Sometimes it likes to settle. And I'm going to try and not paint in this recessed area. Not get the metal paint in there to leave it darker. And I painted outside the lines here, so again, I'm going to clean that up. And I'm also going to paint the claws and her scorpion tail. Go back, since this metallic color is dry, and add some more in here. Same with the gold. And I'm going to get my small brush out and highlight the edge of the sword with some white. And along this edge too. And add some highlights here. And I don't want to forget her tail. And then last but not least, she has some red jewels. So I'm going to grab some red paint and add the finishing touches. So again, just base coating. And since it's red, it's going to take a couple of layers. And I'm going to go in and clean up around the jewel where I painted outside my lines. And I'm going to just use a little bit of my light yellow for my highlight. And a dot of white there. Thank you so much for joining me in this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed painting the Manticore from Quests of Yore.